Lecture 3 takes us into Reforming Wisdom Creation section, the historical perspective. Genesis is literally about the beginning of beginnings, and therefore the content itself is outside of both space and time. Attempts to place it in a cosmography lead to confusion and conflict. It does not fit in our universe. There is no concrete identification of historical persons, groups, movements, or institutions. There are parallel creation and even flood stories in a variety of Near Eastern cultures, and creation stories all over the entire globe. Most of them begin with creation out of something, as opposed to creation out of nothing. Pursuing the Genesis creation story as a historical fact or as a scientific fact will lead to conflict with current scientific theories and theological norms. It puts our assumptions and our inferences in conflict with the story. However, pursuing Genesis's early chapters as myth alone may circumvent those deep theological questions of the nature of God and the relationships of creation. Any attempts to harmonize the two leads to dissonance from both directions. In a distinctly Lutheran way, one must approach the creation chapter of Genesis as both fact and fiction. We also must consider it as neither fact nor fiction. These paradoxes are very hard to process, but both and, as well as neither nor, is crucial. To read the book of Genesis as a treatise on relationships places us in a particular frame of mind, one in which we are echoing Martin Luther's readings and lectures on the same book. Martin Luther used a spiritual, effective interpretation of Genesis to develop in his students a new identity as evangelical Christians. This new evangelical Christian identity was different from the Catholic identity of the medieval past. Martin Luther did not reach for allegories or metaphors to try to explain the inexplicable in Scripture. He did not limit his explanations to modern exegesis, that is, the historical and grammatical understanding of the intention of the author. Whatever the author intended is always supposition, particularly when they write under pseudonyms, under anonymity, or as a group of editors. We can't reduce Bible stories and Bible verses to the intention of the author. As a result of not limiting exegesis to simply the intention of the author, or a historical analysis, or a grammatical analysis, we are required to look at the Scripture again with the intent of the divine in mind. For Luther, biblical exposition involved prayerful, meditative hearing of the text in the context of the struggles of Christian life in the world. from Luther's lecture on Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. Luther's meditations on the opening verses brought him to a place that causes us to question how we define things. When we say earth, it is not the kind upon which we stand now, and the physical locations don't make sense to us here and now. This creation and what preceded it, if anything other than God, defies our logic. Our experiences are the bridge between the unknowable divine, and the humanly explainable. The very simple meaning of what Moses says, therefore, is this: everything that is was created by God. The scientific, philosophic process of how this was achieved is secondary. We are once again bridging the gap between human and a divine, aware of and reaching into an unknowable on both sides, while living in a human-explained, potentially understandable present through God's grace. One of the definitions with which we struggle is the definition of time. Luther says it is folly to argue much about God outside of and before time, because this is an effort to understand the Godhead without covering, or the uncovered divine essence. Word games have been played since the creation of the priestly castes, from the discussion of the inclusion or the exclusion of angels at work in the creation of the world. To the forwarding of human agendas and human political goals being given some sort of ecclesiastical caste. Definitions, clearly thought out and articulated, require discernment and deep thought and carefully chosen words. How we approach the question of time and its definition in this day and age. It is written, Christ existed before the creation of the world, because Christ also says, before Abraham was, I am. And it is written in Proverbs, before the heavens were, I am. These statements alone defy a simple human definition of time. Some questions for consideration. There are always basic questions that we can ask about the scripture and about the analysis. If you're looking for more specific questions, here's a few that could get you started. You're not limited to these questions. And these are personal discernment questions. These are things for you to think about. And if we have a discussion group, we can discuss them there. Or you can simply journal about them, ponder them, whatever you would like. For instance, what relationships come to mind when you hear this Bible passage in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2? What do we think of when we place time into the passage? What do we think it means to be in the world, and how is this different in creation, in the historical time of Christ, in medieval times, in Luther's time, or in our present? How is this passage a bridge rather than a beginning?